Say that in this season, it's better to give than to receive. And of course, the tax man has his deadline of December 31st. We would love to see more supporters to the Elderly Affordable Society that allows these programs to go on at the Carey Institute. And we would welcome to have you join the ranks of members and donors to Carey. So there in this season. Let me also say that on January 10th, we have our next Friday night program. Alan Wiseman, who authored The World Without Us a couple of years ago, now has a new book, Countdown, Our Last Best Hope for a Future on Earth, in which he deals with the rise of human population and what that will mean for our future and the future of the planet. So Friday night, January 10th, right here. Clearly know the way, and we'll see you for that next program. But tonight we have a special friend, special guest with us, Verlyn Klinkenborg, to tell us about his new book, More Scenes from the Rural Life. Verlyn is a native of Iowa, went to Pomona College, got a PhD at Princeton. What am I running into here? Bought a farm in Austerlitz in 1997, started writing about the rural life and farming and dealing with rural culture in 1997 for the New York Times, where many of you have probably seen his work. New York Times board, the editorial board there, and has a raft of books, I'm Fine, Rural Life, and More Scenes from the Rural Life, that all pick up on the daily culture that makes life in Dutchess County and life in the Mid-Hudson Valley and across Massachusetts and Connecticut so delightful. And he's here to tell us about his new book, give us a few readings, answer questions, and afterwards, in our usual fashion, the Merritt Bookstore will have some of his titles available for Verlyn to sign for you. So, once again, glad to see you all here tonight. Verlyn Klinkenborg.
Just have to make sure you can hear me. No, not yet. We'll get somebody. I'll keep talking here. Let me tell you about this book. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I live about an hour north of the comics, so I found the same letter you did. My farm is about 500 feet higher than here, so I'm sure it's already freezing rain and snow. But I thought I'd read a few pieces from this book, which is a distillation, a collection of the last decade's worth of editorial essays for the New York Times. A lot of people think that, I mean, it's wrong if this is all I do. And I have to explain to them that the 16 years I've been on the editorial board, for most of that time, I've written between 100 and 120 editorials for the editorial page on the subject of the environment, often on cultural issues, on land planning, especially on the American West, because nobody on the editorial board seems to know much about the American West, except for me, which I find kind of odd. In any case, let me read a few of these pieces, but I'd like to save some time for questions. And that to me is always the most interesting part of the evening. I'm much more interested in what's on your mind than what's in mine. So if you've got some questions about writing, farming, fencing, chickens, the New York Times, please think of them. Don't be reluctant to ask. So let me start at the beginning. I may have to go.
Just
Okay.
the kitchen.
Okay. Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
Is that right?
No. Louder.
A little louder, okay?
There, that's it.
I'll try to shout. How's that? Anyway, when I was a boy, so these stories always begin, I spent a summer or two on my eldest uncle's farm in northwestern Iowa. It was a farm where my father was raised, and when I say I spent a summer or two there, I mean it's summer in all my memories of the place. The sun is hot on the cracked sidewalk leading down from the back door to the garden gate. The lilacs are long over. The grove is in full, ominous leaf. But in photographs from my father's childhood, it's often winter on the farm. You can see in those photographs that the farmsteads in the distance have been joined, not separated, by the snow lying out in the fields. In the mudroom between the kitchen and the back door of the farmhouse, there were signs of winter even in the summers when I came to visit. Enormous quilted coveralls, oil-stained at the cuffs, hung by the nape on hooks, like headless convicts, all in a row. I knew that in winter the mud in the machine yard froze into unbelievable shapes, and I imagined that in the animal yards a fog sometimes lay dormant just above the backs of the cattle, and that in the low houses where the chickens and pigs were kept, the body heat was often oppressive, too liquid, too penetrating to tolerate for long. On that farm, there were dairy cows, beef cattle, hogs, and both the laying and the cooking kinds of chickens. In my father's day, there had been draft horses and sheep and geese and a goat or two as well. In other words, there had lived on that farm at one time or another bulls, steers, heifers, cows, calves, boars, sows, shoats, goats, colts, fillies, geldings, mares, stallions, roosters, cockerels, hens, pullets, ganders, geese, goslings, rams, ewes, kids, and lambs. To each of these, a breed name was also assigned, and each came in a color that could be named specifically to. Some of these creatures also had personal names or an impromptu moniker that singled out a uniqueness, like a twisted horn or a hostile temperament. Of all these distinctions, I was unaware. To me, even the difference between beef cattle and dairy cows was confusing at first. But what wasn't confusing was the appeal of these animals, their power over my imagination. Even now, remembering those days, I feel as though I'm looking past the horizon of my own life and into a painting by Constable. In the afternoons, the dairy herd really did walk up an elm-shaped lane to a small, heavily trodden yard where they stood meticulously aware of rank, waiting to be admitted to the milking parlor. The door would be slid back on its rollers, and one Holstein, always the same one, would make her way up the concrete ramp, swinging her rectangular head side to side as she came through the doorway, and then stepping along the barn to her stanchion with all the gravity of a town woman carrying a hot dish to a church supper. The air would soon be filled with barn swallows and the rhythmic wheezing sound of automatic milkers. Almost every day, I found myself in a corner of the farmyard where the hog fence met the side of the granary. There I could stand on one of the fence rails, being careful not to let my feet poke through to the other side, and I could look in on the life of pigs. Unlike the humid climate in the farrowing house next door, the atmosphere above the hog pen seemed to be filled with molecular dust that held the light. There were bogs of mud in the low spots, as there are in every good hog pen, Yet this was an overwhelmingly dry place, the locus of an effete, hair-splitting rationalism espoused by thin-skinned philosophers who were also profound students of their own bodily comfort. The hogs lolled, they fretted, they batted their small eyes in the noontime light. They tried to convey their intelligence to one another and to me, but failed. All the wood in the pen as high as a pig's back was sanded smooth by their rowing, which I didn't understand until the first time I stroked a mature boar's pompadour and realized that it was bristle. Cleanliness was a fetish among the humans in the milk room, where milk was filtered and cooled in a stainless steel tank, but it was no less a fetish among the hogs in the hog pen that we had to look for it. The hog, perhaps the cleanest spot on the whole farm, was the hog trough between meals. Its inner surface had been worn as smooth as ivory, as smooth as the trencher of an ascetic desert saint. But it wasn't only the animals I noticed, it was also the humans among the animals. I was struck by my Uncle Everett's fearlessness as he moved among the hogs, a fearlessness all the more remarkable because the hog pen had been represented to me as a terribly dangerous place. If a cow leaned too heavily on one of my cousins as he washed her back before milking, he would simply thump her on her bony flank until she stood over it. I, who had grown up almost solely on people, expected to see human responses from these animals: resentment, outrage, peevishness. I didn't realize that the high disdain with which cattle treated my cousins was a form of comedy, or that the squealing of the hogs as my uncle moved among them was absurd self-dramatization. Do you suppose it was anyone's purpose, let alone the collective purpose of so many human generations, to breed so much dignity into farm animals? Who needed the intellect of the pig, its radical smartness? Who would set out to engender an eye as calm and unjudging, yet so capable of reflecting human self-judgment as the eye you see in the head of a cow? Yet there they are, reminders of how utterly interwoven our fates have turned out to be. Farm animals are the product of co-evolution with humans, or rather we're the product of co-evolution with them. They are twinned with us. The word that applies to our link with them is neither bond nor contract. It's covenant. One of the things I discovered writing rural essays for the Times was that once you own a pig, you always own a pig. What I mean is that I haven't owned pigs in about 4 years, but every reader I meet assumes that my property is covered with pigs. And I've tried to think about what that is. Is it something in me, or is it the fact that pigs are to many people a kind of alien presence? And I'm hoping it's the latter. So I feel an obligation to read at least one more pig piece before I go on to anything more serious. So I will get that out of the way. I should say that if you've never lived with pigs, give it a try. It's really a wonderful experience. And if you have any anxiety about keeping them fenced in, as I did for practically the entire year before I got them, I'm now an expert on that. I can tell you all about it. I've always wanted to give a seminar in pig fencing, but I've never had the opportunity. Anyway, this is a piece that was written for, of all places, Good Housekeeping. It was part of a series of pieces they commissioned about well-known sayings and what they meant to the writers. So, life is full of things you'd never think of doing until someone tells you not to. Casting pearls before swine is one of them. I've never owned pearls, but I do own a pair of swine. They're handsome pigs, energetic and cheerful, full of advice when I show up with the dinner bucket. My wife has no pearls either, but over the past few months, she and I have cast lots of things before our swine. Fresh apples, pineapple rinds, buckets of roasted peanuts, bruised melons, a whole pickup load of spoiled sweet corn. The pigs snuffle it all up. I'd like to think that if we had pearls in the house, we'd toss them into the pig pen just to see what happens. What stops us is having been taught all these years never to cast pearls before swine, and no pearls. Even as a child, I knew that pearls in the phrase were really one's own good qualities or talents. Don't waste them on the rabble was the gist of the saying. But I lived in the Midwest, where something that sounds like a farm saying usually was a farm saying. Swine may be a figure of speech in other parts of the country, but where I grew up, there were many more swine than metaphors. The pigs I knew best belonged to my Uncle Everett. When I was young, he seemed like a stern man to me, sterner and sterner the closer we got to the pig pen. He wasn't about to throw pearls before swine or let me do so either. Keeping pearls away from the pigs was just practical advice. It started a long list of things to keep out of the pig pen, including batteries, light bulbs, and baby brothers. It's worth remembering that this warning about pigs and jewelry first appears in the Sermon on the Mount. It dates from a time when swine ran free, and when, just walking down to the mailbox, you could find yourself cornered by pigs demanding pearls. In those days, casting your pearls before swine might have been a good idea. I've tried over the years to apply this saying to humans and their behavior, to cultivate the cautiousness and the reserve it suggests. But it never really works. At its heart, that saying contains an arrogance I'm not really comfortable with. Separating the sheep from the goats is one thing when it comes to humans. Separating the sheep from the goats from the swine is something else entirely. I'm just not up to it, especially because the saying seems to take it for granted that pigs are nasty, brutish animals incapable of appreciating the finer things in life. But I've found swine to be tolerant creatures, trusting, sincere, and completely honest. They repay kind treatment, an extra apple, a belly rub, a squirt from the water hose on a hot summer day with real joy. I don't spend nearly enough time in the pen hanging out and trying to see things as they see them. They see me coming, and frankly, I look like a bushel of pig feet. But the moral is really this. You don't want to hoard your pearls unless you're sure they're pearls. And you don't want to decide that the world is full of swine until you're sure you know what you mean when you say swine. I'd be proud to think that my pigs saw only the best of me. This is one of the fun things about living in the country, as you almost know, is life is always changing day by day. I just answered some interview questions from a magazine in which the person asked me, how do you find new things to write about? And I had to actually explain, because this person was in LA, that in the country every day is different, especially if you're looking closely. I'm sure every day is different in LA too, depending on how closely you're looking too. But this is a piece that, talking with my brother, suggested, as you'll see. Earlier this summer, I emailed my brother a list of the animals we're raising on this farm. I called it an inventory, but it was really a way of acknowledging that perhaps we've gone too far. There are now 5 pigs in various stages of growth in a large commissary of ducks and geese. There are chicks in the basement and chickens in the mulch. And there are longtime partners in this enterprise, horses, dogs, and cats. My brother, who has 3 pigs and 4 goats, wrote back and said, wouldn't it be great to know the real inventory? That phrase has stuck in my mind for the past few weeks. I sent my brother a list of the animals that I'm responsible for, the ones I need to feed and water every day. But I haven't even begun to count creatures that are responsible for themselves. Even among those, the animals I think of first are the ones that have a direct relationship with me. The phoebes that nest above the kitchen door, the fox that steals hens from the coop, the wild turkeys that troop into the pasture in winter, the red-tailed hawks that screech overhead driving poultry cover. There are others, of course, hummingbirds in the bee balm and hollyhocks, pileated woodpeckers in the deep woods, catbirds in the elderberry. But these too belong to a circle of animals that seem scaled to human powers of observation. What makes the real inventory interesting is all the rest of the organisms that live on this place, whether I notice them or they notice me. Sometimes I get a vague sense of how vast that inventory might be. Nights when the crickets ring in my ears, evenings when the low sun is refracted in the wings of thousands of insects in flight over the pasture. But it's still only a vague sense, a catalog of life forms whose numbers I have to guess at. I imagine the abundance of life here in the shape of a pyramid, the kind of illustration that might appear in a school book, with a pair of humans at peak and legions of soil bacteria at base. But one of the things I've learned living here is that life isn't a pyramid with humans at peak. It's an interrelationship far too complex to diagram so anthropocentrically and so simply. There's a map of need here that I can't read, but it governs me as well. I go about the endless tasks, the chores, the feeding and grooming of animals, and I pretend that I'm separate and in charge. The pigs and geese remind me that that's not exactly true. If I wrote the real inventory, I'd have to include myself as well. I wrote in 2005 and early 2006 a book called Timothy, or Notes of an Abject Reptile. And it's a book that is written in the voice of an 18th century tortoise. The tortoise that really lived. It's a book of nonfiction. Everything in it is true. My publisher sells it as a novelist, but I believe deeply that it's nonfiction. It doesn't matter that the tortoise is speaking. But the fun of it was getting to know Gilbert White, who was a great 18th century ecologist, the author of The Natural History of Selborne, and a man who kept a journal for, I'd say, 45 years of his life. A very tiny journal. Every day he would jot down the weather conditions outside, and he would put down a sentence or two about what was blooming, what was being harvested, how the bees were doing. Nothing more than that. It was almost like 18th century haiku. It's really extraordinarily beautiful. And I want to read a passage that came from kind of the blog version of Rural Life in 2006 that talks about Gilbert White and his entry for that date. And he's talking about the raising of hops, the aromatic that is used in making beer. And that was a big industry around Selborne in the 18th century. And this is what he has to say about it. It's May 1st in his book. Reading Gilbert White's entry for this date, which says, "Men polled hops," I'm struck, as always, by the economy of this journal. That is, I'm struck by the scale and complexity of the world barely visible to us that lies behind his brief notes. Behind that one phrase, "Men poll hops," you have to imagine the change this activity would have brought to Selborne. The parish was filled with small hop gardens, many of them carefully protected from the wind by hedges. Each garden was planted in mounds laid out in a checkerboard pattern, sometimes a quinquance. By now, the farmers would have opened the mounds and examined the roots of the hops, choosing the stronger shoots, the ones that aren't worn out apart, as one early writer puts it, and adding new mold and compost to them. Then comes a day when everyone in the village turns to the labor of carrying the hop poles, made of ash or chestnut, into the gardens and erecting them. These poles were often 20 feet long and set firmly in the earth. As John Worlich puts it in Systema Agriculturae, it is esteemed an excellent piece of husbandry. It is esteemed an excellent piece of husbandry to set all the poles inclining towards the south, that the sun may the better compass them. This is most evident, that a leaning or bending pole bears more hops than an upright. So imagine the transformation. Suddenly, in late April, the parish sprouts a forest of bare poles. When the wind is high, they sound a note all their own. Before long, women will come into the hop garden and tie the vines to the poles. By mid-June, the vines will have run out of poles, turning each of these gardens into a patchwork of light and shade. By mid-August, the bloom has begun. Each year brings its own variation. Some years, the hops, the flowers themselves, promise well. Some years, like 1773, a tempest blows up and makes sad havoc among the hops, knocking down the poles and tearing the vines. Some years, like June 1783, it's sultry and misty, weather that men think injurious to hops. By late September, the hops have been picked, an extraordinary thing in itself. And the whole air of the village of the evening is perfumed by effluvia from the hops drying in the kilns. In early October, the bagged hops are carried to Weybridge Fair and put up for sale. I add merely as a note that John Worlich recommends a tea made of water and pigeon dung for fertilizing hop hills. I have to add here, just as a point of detail, I mentioned women tying the vines to the poles. What they used to do that was a crocus leaf torn in half. It's an extraordinary thing. It's just as extraordinary as noting that in Gilbert White's journal, he marks down the nights in which Venus shines so brightly that it casts a shadow. Think about what that would mean. How bright, how dark would it have to be before Venus actually cast a shadow? He also talks about, for instance, the fact that lamb in a dry year tastes very different than lamb in a wet year. There's a kind of sensory engagement with the world that's really almost impossible to recover and wonderful to look back upon. Now, this book contains not only these sort of pastoral moments, it contains a few of the more serious pieces that I've written for the Times about agriculture, about scientific issues. A good example is one day I opened the paper and the headline, one of the sub-headlines was something along the lines about the debate over evolution, and it drove me to my mind because I called the science editor and said, what debate? And then wrote a piece about how difficult it is for humans to perceive the true depth of time. Those are the kind of issues that crop up. And this is another one that popped up in 2007. Of course, the numbers will change, but the principle behind it will not. Recently, Science magazine published an article called Domesticated Nature, which noted in passing that by 1995, only 17% of the world's land area had escaped direct influence by humans. The article was accompanied by one map showing the human footprint on Earth and another showing the interlacing of road networks and shipping lanes across the globe. That 17% figure is now smaller, and the weave of that interlacing of transport networks gets tighter every day. The article assumes what is obviously true. There really is no such thing as nature untainted by people. That was a radical thought in 1989 when Bill McKibben's book, Nature, first appeared. Now it's axiomatic. What does it mean to go from a humanly ancient world in which, say, only 17% of nature had been tainted, to use the author's word, to a world in which only 17% remains untainted? It's also tempting to wonder where that remaining 17% is and how to protect it. It can't be far away, just off a sea lane or a two-track road running into the distance, which makes it all the harder to protect. The authors of this article take the domestication of nature as inevitable, a natural part of human behavior, and wonder what the trade-offs among ecosystem services might be. You may want to ponder this too the next time you go for a long walk among the ecosystem services. What I find most worrying here isn't really the premise of so much loss. It's the emergence of a world in which nature means little more than the consequences of human decisions. That world has been emerging for a long time. Humans first arose in a densely articulated natural world on a globe that had been unaffected by human activity because there was none for several billion years. We are who we are as a species in part because of the natural intricacy in which we emerged. In a way, we originated in an alien world, alien in the sense that almost nothing we saw around us had been made or shaped or influenced by us. It may sound like folly to talk about the wisdom of nature, but its wisdom is that it will not simply show us ourselves. Wisdom is always a kind of otherness. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but consider where we are now. The authors of the science article are certainly right when they stress the importance of stewarding nature in perpetuity for people as opposed to simply trying to protect nature from people. But they have more faith in people than I do, both in our ability to steward nature and to decide what stewarding it for people really means. It's possible to make wiser and wiser choices, but what if the world we make our choices in steadily becomes, in natural terms, poorer and less diverse? More and more we find ourselves choosing only among the consequences of regrettable choices we made before. Humans are competent to do many things, but we're not competent to run a global ecosystem. Something has been irretrievably lost by the time we begin to believe that we can manage nature in perpetuity for people. My lack of faith in humans as global managers isn't just a philosophical conclusion. It's based on the sorry evidence. We've begun to run the global ecosystem already, and we're doing a terrible job of it. Our minds are rich, but our purposes are simple, and though our purposes complicate the world around us socially and culturally, they also simplify the natural environment around us, simplify it to the point of tragedy. What we'll never be able to provide on our own is feedback from a natural world that's not human. The authors of the science article are right in asking the environmental movement to think of its main business now as managing the trade-offs in ecosystem services. The idea is rational, realistic, and human, and it accurately reflects where we've gotten to. But it's not good enough. We love the hidden metaphor in domestication, the idea that we're making the world more home-like for our species. But without alien feedback from the natural world, which enriches and outstrips our imagination, we'll find ourselves less and less at home on this planet. In a way, these more sober pieces, these pieces that are really about issues that are science, issues that are culture, issues that are really about the way we have been affected by and affect nature. I think I would have a hard time writing the rural life pieces without those other pieces to balance them. The rural life is a lot of fun to write, and I have to be very careful about it because every now and then someone thinks I'm a farmer, and I remind them, no, I'm just a guy who has some money and some horses and some chores. The real farmers are my cousins who really farm. These other pieces, the ones that are grimmer and darker and that form the interlude of this book, are the ones that really shape my habitation on the farm and really summarize the kinds of things I think about most of the time. It's not all just about what the horses are making of me. I do want to read a piece that's pretty much right out of where we are in the weather. A couple of days ago, we had what the forecasts call a wintry mix, which sounds to me like something you set out in bowls at a cocktail party this time of year. It was in fact rain and snow and sleet mixed with sand and salt and the sludge that gets thrown from the tread of tires. One minute the snow was falling in clumps, and the next it was raining. The sky was the color of duct tape, and it let about that much light through. A wintry mix makes you want to stay home, or perhaps go into the world foraging for provisions, simply for the pleasure of getting home again. This is the kind of weather, true November weather, in which I learned to admire the stoicism of the animals all over again. Stoicism is the wrong word, if only because it implies an awareness of being stoic, a sense of putting up with what you have to put up with. I know the horses are aware, but I understand it as an awareness that isn't busy comparing states of being. They stand over their hay in the wintry mix, and they seem to take it as it comes. I imagine them thinking, no flies, as a way of enjoying the spring weather. Even that implies a differential frame of state of mind. Till now, this has been a bright, open autumn. The most vivid fall colors came and went. The sugar maples garish, as always, leaving behind the oaks, which hold their leaves far longer. The last few weeks have been dusted with a dry wooden light, and the oaks have shown just how various and pungent their colors can be, while behind them the beeches hold out their leaves more stiffly. It is as if the oaks had all stepped forward a couple of weeks ago to reveal their pendulous, lobed leaves, to remind us of the spectrum of color that goes on display most years. Everything changes on a wintry day. The woods seem to withdraw, though the snow on the ground creates the illusion that you can see deeper into them. The brightness vanishes, and that gives all the subtler colors a heightened presence. It doesn't take the oxblood of the oak's leaves to impress you. It takes only the variations of gray on the bark of a maple tree. As voluminous as the woods seem in midsummer when they're full of shadow, now is the time they seem most corporeal, most alive. I don't mean the fact that you can trace a squirrel's route along the maple high line, or watch the woodpeckers in the hickory lining up pursuit. I mean that the trees seem to be making a gesture of a kind they never do when the leaves are green, as though they can only really be themselves when the light is low and the air is damp and the year is drawing in. This is a little after the fact, but when I joined the editorial board in 1997, all of my colleagues who were all new to me, I had known none of them before because I was a journalist at the time. They all came up and congratulated me with this kind of secretive smile on their face. I couldn't figure out what they were so happy about until I realized that I had inherited the task of writing editorials for every holiday. And they used to distribute it around, and they would all take turns, and they hated it. And if you read the paper on last Thursday, you read my 16th Thanksgiving piece. And one of my editors, I think the thing that fascinates him about me, the only thing that fascinates him about me is that I never seem to run out of things to say about Thanksgiving. I want to read actually one of those Thanksgiving pieces. This is from several years ago. And there isn't much food talk in here, so it's not like we're moving back to the menu. Maybe there is. No, here it is. There's the food talk. Of course. I'm sitting in the northwest corner of my grandmother's table in a house on the edge of a small Iowa town. I'm young enough to feel that my presence at the table is motion, There's something bewildering in the passing of plates, the coming and going of serving dishes, and I can see, looking into this memory from a long ways away, that the adults at the table find my presence a little comical. It makes them speak to each other in asides, and to me in a language that seems both ironic and slightly formal, as if I were an ambassador from the everyday planet of children to the special planet of Thanksgiving, where dinner is eaten in 3. With the turkey comes teasing. Here come the mashed potatoes, and teasing. Cranberry sauce, more teasing. It's the condiment of choice at this Thanksgiving table, and I'm very fond of it, in part because the adults are so busy teasing each other too. I really have no idea what they're saying, but I can sense the pleasure in how they're saying it. I don't understand the way they make each other laugh, but I end up laughing with them. Even now, I can almost taste that laughter, the way I can still smell an overcooked undertone in the turkey gravy. The women orbit the table, never sitting for long. Their responsibilities are clearly superior to the men's and more immediate. Back and forth to the kitchen they go, always with an air of preoccupation, as though some secret is hidden there in the oven, behind the sink, out on the porch. This is fussing, which isn't entirely unrelated to teasing. It too is a kind of attention, a language that in one aunt is puzzling and anxiously self-referential, while in another it's the soul of generosity. Soon we're also busy eating, and my presence at this table of adults is no longer something separate or special. It's as though they all forget at once that I'm here. Somehow that makes them especially visible to me. I can watch them without being watched myself. And what I notice isn't one adult or another. It isn't the place settings or the table decorations or the hands and elbows and napkins and mouths. It's the way it all comes together, the clearing created by sitting around a table and facing each other over a feast. I was young enough then to be getting down from the table after pumpkin pie rather than getting up the way the grown-ups do. And I'm surprised to realize that I remember the feeling of doing so. It seemed to me that something was missing. Thinking back, I don't know what it was. Grace was said at the start of the meal, a pause before eating, but we should have paused at the end of the meal for a second grace before we all left the table. All these years later, I haven't turned out to be a grace-saying man, but I'm grateful for the people around me and for their coming together. The thanks we say as we sit down together is also the thanks we should say before we separate, before we're hurried away into life. Let me skip on a little bit. There's a lot of, the strange part about this book, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that it gathers up 10 years of my life, which was written out paragraph by paragraph, and suddenly there it all is, without me intending to put it down. It's very odd. This is a piece that's about reading, which to me is second nature to nature. It's the thing that happens at the farm more than anything else. And it's really the source of my consciousness as a writer. My students are always asking me, how do I keep going as a writer? And what they mean is, I know that when I'm not taking your class, I'm not going to be able to write as much as I do every week. I'm going to feel guilty. So what do? And I have to actually explain to them that reading is writing. That as long as they're taking it in, they're contributing to their writing. They don't actually know this, which I find kind of astonishing. But they're greatly relieved, I can tell you. Anything you can do to dispel the guilt of a Yale student is a sure reward later in life, I think. Anyway, I've always admired my friends who are wide readers. One or two even pride themselves on never reading a book a second time. I've been a wide reader at times as well, foraging outward, working my way through a long string of books by leaping from illusion to illusion. But at heart, I'm a rereader. The point of reading outward wide has always been to find the books I want to reread and then to reread them. In part, that's an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that no matter how long and how wide they are, I'll only ever make my way to a tiny portion of the world's literature. And in part, it's a concession of the limits of my memory, which is overtaxed by the simple job of remembering which books I've actually read, never mind what's in them. My memory is like a beach in which the sand that washes out to sea is replaced grain for grain by the sand the sea washes in. I forget a lot, in other words, which makes the pleasure of rereading all the greater. of repetition seems to be ingrained in children, as every parent knows, and it's certainly ingrained in the way children learn to read. Witness the maddening bedtime love of hearing that same book read aloud all over again, word for word, inflection for inflection. Childhood is an oasis of repetitive acts, so much so that there's something shocking about the first time a young reader reads a book only once and then moves on to the next. There's a hunger in that act, but also a kind of forsaking, a glimpse of adulthood to come. The work I chose to do in adulthood contained, by definition, the childish pleasure of rereading. To be a literature student in graduate school meant being a close reader, i.e., a close rereader. Once, through Alexander Pope's Dunciad or John Berryman's Dream Songs, it wasn't going to cut. A grasp of the poem presumed to lie on the far side of many rereadings, none of which were really repetitions. And the same is true of being a writer. The work of writing is partly the work of obsessive rereading, to an extent that most non-writers would never believe. But the real rereading I mean is savory rereading, the books I have to be careful not to reread too often so I can read them again with pleasure. It's a miscellaneous library, always shifting. It's included a book of the North Woods, John J. Rowlands' Cache Lake Country, which I reread annually for many years. It may still include Raymond Chandler, though I won't know for sure until the next time I reread him. It includes Michael Kerr's Dispatches and lots of A.J. Liebling and a surprising amount of George Eliot. It once included nearly all Dickens, but that has since been boiled down to two, The Pickwick Papers and Great Expectations. There are many more titles, of course. This isn't a canon. This is refuge. Part of the fun of rereading is that you're no longer bothered by the business of finding out what happens. Rereading Middlemarch of The Great Gatsby, I no longer have to pay attention to the motion of the train. I'm able to look out the window and contemplate the scenery as the sentences go by. While the plot is busy taking place, I'm able to pay attention to what's really happening in the thicket of the language itself. A pleasure as great as discovering who marries whom, who dies and who does not. The real secret of rereading is simply this: it's impossible. The characters remain the same, the words never change, but the reader always does. Pip is there to be revisited, but you, the reader, are a little like the convict who surprises him in the graveyard, always a stranger. I look at the books on my library shelves, they certainly seem dormant. But what if the characters are quietly rearranging themselves while shelved? What if Emma Woodhouse doesn't learn from her mistakes? What if Tom Jones descends into a sodden life of poaching and outlawry? What if Eve resists Satan, remembering God's injunction and Adam's loving advice? I imagine all the characters rushing to get back into place as they feel me taking the book down from the shelf. Hurry, they say. He'll expect to find us exactly where he left us, never mind how much life has changed for him in the meantime. Just a couple more pieces, and then I would love to take some questions. I think what I'll do is I want to read a couple of pieces about a horse named Remedy. And he is the hero of this book in every way. The way to describe who he is that in the 1990s I hauled my horses to Wyoming and Montana from New York every summer and spent the whole summer out there riding with really wonderful trainers, mostly with Verlyn, who's a friend and a glorious horse trainer. And I didn't know I was not a writer. I was a writer, not a writer. And so I thought, well, I'll just throw myself into this. So there would be a horse training clinic at the Sheridan Fairgrounds in Sheridan, Wyoming, and I would call up a friend and say, can you find a horse that needs to be started or a troubled horse that needs some work? And I'll come and work on it for 5 days in the clinic. In other words, I was throwing myself into something I knew nothing about. And after a couple of years of trying to learn how to do this stuff, I really got terribly frightened. I haven't been hurt. I'd seen some people badly hurt, and I realized I didn't know anything. I knew tons and tons, but I knew nothing about how to actually move with a horse. a really good friend of mine, Buck's sister-in-law actually, said what you need is a horse that knows everything and that can teach you. And that's who Remedy was. I found him in Colorado and brought him back in 1997, and look at the rest. This is in 2010. I'm standing in the barnyard with the farrier. Remedy, the quarter horse, is getting his winter shoes. We're surrounded by vast heaps of plowed snow, the kind my friends and I loved to tunnel through when we were kids. It's a sparkling day, and for some reason I find myself thinking about a photograph we found after my father died. My grandfather is sitting on a high bank of snow wearing work clothes, and he's holding up a fox terrier which looks like it's ready to eat the camera. This is the home farm in northwest Iowa, probably 1936. In the background is the barn where the draft horses lived. I don't know whether my grandfather was his own horse shoer, but I doubt it. So there must have come many days like the one I'm having now, standing in the cold beside a sleepy horse, while a man with a damaged thumb and a sore back goes about his work. In all these years, the technology has hardly changed. Fire, steel, nails, rasp, hammer, anvil, and a pair of heavy shafts with a kind in a leather pocket, a patient horse, and an extra human to hold the lead rope. I knew that farm long after the horses had been replaced by tractors. When I was older, I tried to get my dad to tell stories about what it was like growing up there during the Depression. He would sometimes talk about the blizzard of 1936, and he always talked about the kindly cunning of the draft horses who loved to lean into him. But those days were always cloaked in a vagueness I never understood, as if the farm was a country from which he'd emigrated and long since put out of mind. I wanted the details, what the work was like, which chores were his, how June differed from January, how much pain and how much pleasure. I never got them. So I look back at the old photos and try to imagine the life there. I think of another photo of my grandfather, face sun-blackened, holding my dad on his knee and a pup in the other arm. My dad's older brothers are there in ragged overalls, each one holding a well-chewed apple. In the background, there's an octagonal brooder house and a long house for laying hens. What I wouldn't give to go back and see it all. The closest I can come is to stand as quietly as Remedy does and wait for the farrier to finish. I close the gate behind him and send the horses thundering up the drive and into the breast-deep snow of the pasture. I hear the rooster crow as I carry an armload of firewood into the house. In early May, this is June 2012, in early May, my neighbor and I moved my 3 horses across the gravel road to her summer pasture. Last year, it took a while before her animals, a thoroughbred named Mule, herded up with mine, but eventually they did. They settled down into a single unit. This year, they did something unexpected. They ejected Remedy from the herd. My neighbor put salve on his bites. When I went to check on him the next morning, I found him standing alone in the shallow creek, as if his feet were hot. His head was to the fence, his tail to all the rest of the world. I bought Remedy in Colorado when he was 19. Now he's 34. He has ruled all the horses as long as I've owned him, wherever we've been, but not anymore. I walked him out of the creek and back to my place and put him in a paddock out of sight of the horses across the road. He was limping slightly, but now that limp has hardened into a deep and permanent hitch in his gait. He gets around as though he's used to the damage, but his orbit in the paddock has grown smaller and smaller. His eyes are bright, his coat gleams, his ears seem to have lengthened as he's aged, but they still twitch with attention. Remedy has always been the youngest old horse I know, but 34 is terribly old for a horse. A wise equestrian friend told me that Remedy would let me know when he's ready to go. I've never seen that moment in dogs and humans, known it for what. I've seen that moment in dogs and humans and known it for what it was, but never in a horse. I'm afraid I won't recognize it, that I'll let him down in dying. He's been such a powerful figure in my life, the remedy to disabling fear that stole upon me unexpectedly one day. He has one more thing to teach me, and I hope I learn it well. And this is the sequel a month later. By the time you read this, I will have filled in Remedy's grave, and that is coming Friday. I promised myself not to write about this, but then I met the man with the backhoe who's digging the grave. His name is Digger, lean and gray, wearing his spectacles well on his nose. I showed him the spot I had in mind in the lower garden. I asked him how much I had owed him. His answer caught me deep inside. Nothing, he said. I've been doing this for free all my life. I've practiced coming lost at a distance for as long as I can, said all the things you can say about an injured 34-year-old horse and his time to go. They sound like compassion and common sense intertwined. But I wasn't prepared for the subtle feeling gift that Vigor is giving me down in the lower garden as I write. I expected the remedy would be himself right up till the end. I know in the best sense what to expect from horses. Vigor reminded me that I don't always know what to expect from humans. There's been a lot of dying on this farm. That's the nature of living with domesticated animals on the edge of the wild and with pigs. The deaths add up over the years. I've seen again and again how forceful and how frail life is. Before I cover Remedy's body, I'll scatter the ashes of Buster, Angus, Tavish, and Darcy in the grave. The first few chickens that died years ago were sentimental losses. But sentimentality washes away, and then you come to the bedrock of grief. The part I hate is that every death brings with it every other death, going all the way back through my life. In my experience, there's no segregating grief by species. Losing Remedy sets all the other losses echoing, animal and human alike. What differs isn't the feeling of grief itself, it's the afterlife. With pets and pigs, there's an unalloyed incandescence. It's always more intense than I expect, but it also burns out quickly. With humans, well, you'll have to write your own sentence here. All I know is that when the vet comes tomorrow and her work is done, I'll be surrounded by the memory of everyone I've ever lost. Thank you.
Let's start off with a few questions and
Yes, there are.
thoughts. I might offer one that, let me hop in here for a second. So we're surrounded by a world of technology, and you certainly, with your students, love the written word, the old books off the shelf. How do you feel about Kindle and the electronic book? Are we losing youth in a sea of electrons, or are we actually gaining more?
I think we're gaining a huge amount. We're losing a lot in the realm of book production. But I've seen how my own reading has changed thanks to the iPad. I've always read a lot, but I read probably 2 or 3 times more than I was 4 years ago when I started. And my only complaint about it really is that book publishers have not figured out yet how to make an electronic book as tactile and beautiful on the page as a physical book. And it's sheer negligence. It's nothing more than that. I find it absolutely fascinating. I've talked with my editor at Pantheon, who published my previous couple of books, and you can tell in conversations that they love the idea of selling electronic books, but as for actually doing the extraordinary things you can do with the look of the page in a device like an iPad, it just does not cross the mind. It's odd to me that it takes graphic novelists and comic writers to really exploit the virtues of the sort of physical page of an iPad in a way that publishers don't. Only this year have I finally begun to buy books where if you touch the footnote, it takes you back to the note. You touch the note again, it brings you back to the text. It used to be you touch the note and you were marooned in the back of the book. How does that work? I mean, honestly, who let that happen? My feeling about all this is that the extraordinary amount of published work that is available to us now is beyond belief. And what I find amazing about it is when I joined the Times in 1997, Google was barely a thing. I remember hearing about this really new service called Google, and I thought I'd tried to be somebody who tried it out really early on. And you could hear, and you could feel in the Times building itself, this feeling, don't trust the internet for anything. Maybe you can get a phone number from it, maybe that's it. Well, you mentioned how much things have changed. For me, the best test is, what am I able to find in pursuing my own scholarship, mostly in PDF form that I couldn't find before? And it is extraordinary. It is just simply staggering. And what we might lose in certain ways, in the physical properties of books, we gain in access to books and libraries that have been closed to all but a handful of people for most of their existence. And that's invaluable. Of course, as I say this, I think about what happens when the power goes out finally. And I hope that we're still archiving the real hard copy, because I do have that. I mean, part of it's living in an old farmhouse when the power goes out. But part of it's just this general awareness. I mean, I've been using computers since 1984, which means how many formats have I gone through to get to where I am now? How much of what I used to do is completely unreadable now? It's funny, I was actually talking with my students last week in class, and my grandfather always used to say it was amazing. He grew up with the horse and buggy, and then the man went to the moon. And I look at my students and I think they're living in this world that is hurtling through change at an unparalleled rate. But then I think about it. As long as they've been aware, they've had cell phones, they've had computers, they've had all the things they have now. They have in different forms. It's actually my generation and the generations around me that went through the extraordinary change to the point where when you refer to a cassette tape, or, I mean, all the kids understand vinyl, but cassette tapes have not made it back into the rotation, let's put it that way. But the idea that they're actually, in an odd way, that they've lived through a more stable couple of decades than I've experienced technologically is kind of fascinating to think about. There's a question back there.
Okay, yes, let's go over here. Thanks, Beth.
As an ecologist,
I'm afraid I can hear you.
as an ecologist, and the refuse that the animals give,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel we should all become more vegetarian?
Should I become more?
Vegetarian.
No, I really don't. And that's not just a self-serving answer. The way I look at it from an agricultural perspective is that animals have got to be part of the cycling system of nutrients. That unless there is something equivalent to animals in the overall circle of life, essentially, something fundamental is missing from the land. And that's, I mean, there are plenty of studies that have borne that out, plenty of things that made it clear that that is the best kind of management, when you have intensively cultivated cropland and pasture land that is cooperatively grazed and used by livestock. From the perspective of the pigs, my pigs, which I used to raise and kill and eat, people would always say, how can you kill your own pigs? How can you eat your own pigs? And my answer was always, whose pigs are you? Whose pigs are you eating? Because I know every mouthful that went into it. I know where their water came from, and not only that, I know that the farmer who came to my place and killed them and slaughtered them did so in the most humane way possible. They were never hauled anywhere. They were never put in a shrieking, holding yard full of pigs. To me, there is a humane way to do this. Now, of course, the issue is not should we all become vegetarians. Do we do without animals or with animals? The question is, can we change animal agriculture as it looks right now? Because animal agriculture as it looks right now is disgusting. The way pigs are raised in the United States, all across the world now, with a few exceptions like Denmark, for some reason, has remarkably humane pork production. The assumption is that we will cram all these animals together in concrete barns, and we will essentially automate them. We'll feed them automatically, we'll water them automatically, we'll make sure they don't have any exposure to the outdoors where diseases lurk, and we'll make sure that they don't, they never essentially become the kind of animals they were bred to be, which is to live outdoors. If you've ever known a pig, you quickly begin to understand what a tragedy confinement farming is. They are extraordinary animals, and the idea of packing them all together into a crowded space simply so that we can cycle them through faster is insane, especially when you consider that in order to confine them in space like that, you have got to be feeding them antibiotics at a steady rate. The pressure of that confinement causes more susceptibility to disease than they would ever experience if they were more open to herd. So, what you see going on is the fact that way more than half of the antibiotics that are sold in the United States go into farm animals. And that means that essentially all those antibiotics have been flushed down the toilet as far as their use for human health is concerned. In other words, you overuse a tool like that, and you essentially begin to breed resistance to it. And that's exactly what's happened. The other thing that I see geneticists always talking about, let's breed chickens more tolerant of confined space. Let's just open the doors, okay? Let's just open the doors and let them out in the pasture, and let's see what happens. I could go on about this, but I think that the trick is it's not either or vegetarian or carnivore. It's careful carnivory. How's that? That's the way I would put it. What I would also say is that it's wonderful to see how many people are raising chickens of their own now these days. It's really become quite a thing. And once they figure out that you don't have to have a rooster to get eggs, you all know this. Pass this along to your friends, okay? It's astonishing how many people do not actually know this. They think, why can't I have chickens because I have a rooster? No. What I discovered is that the economic side of things, which is the value of the eggs, the value of the birds as meat, is nothing to what they actually teach you about your own limitations as a human. They teach you so much about the extent of their sensory perception, the differences in the way they look at the world compared to how we look at the world. It's an extraordinary education. To me, it's like the last refinement of a liberal arts education. You get educated really well, you get a PhD, you teach in all these fancy places, and then you buy some pigs and chickens, and they teach you how much you're really worth. There's something to be said for that. I find that is actually ultimately the reason I still have chickens and horses. It's not for any other benefit than the fact that they look at me like I'm very strange every time I go outside. Another question? Mm-hmm.
I was interested in something you were describing before regarding the parts of the earth that are untouched by humans, and I have a bit of a question that relates to that, which is what is your thinking? How do you think about the future, and especially as it relates to what I would consider deep time, geologic change? Because with that perspective, I feel much more comfortable than today.
Well, it's how do I think about the future? That is the only question in some ways, and I think about it with essentially profound despair most of the time. I think that the refuge that really assists me is cosmological. It is literally going out on a really clear night, looking at the stars, and realizing how tiny we really are, and how it doesn't matter how irrelevant we are, because that's not even a question. Relevance isn't the issue. It's just we're here, and we come and go in a blink of an eye as individuals, as a species, perhaps even as a planet. And that long view is really hard to hold in your head for more than a few minutes at a time, because it doesn't lead to any kind of action. It doesn't really do much to spur you on to make changes. But what I find interesting now is getting to know the people who are working hardest to prevent the things that make me despair. People like Verlyn Klinkenborg. I had a student in my Yale forestry school class this semester who is an executive for Greenpeace, and we had a bear on last week, and my question was, how do you do it? How do you face that day in, day out onslaught of bad news that you guys are trying to confront? I mean, I face it my own way in filtering all this news from the editorial page while I'm trying to choose things right. And she said, for her consolation is that she's trying to do something about it, even though she knows it's most likely relatively ineffective. I don't need to sound so despairing about this, except for the fact that when I look at the numbers, and I think that we're just about 7 billion people, and the thinking is that we'll go over 9.5 about by the end of the century, and people start calculating how much land we'll need, or how much more intensively we'll need farmland in that time, I start to think, okay, let's ask the question the proper way. Can we feed 9 billion people? That's not the question. The question is, can we feed 9 billion people without extraordinary, final, ultimate damage to all other species on this planet? Unless you're asking the question, what happens to habitat and what happens to other species, as you think about what happens to agriculture and how we feed ourselves, you're not asking a real question. You're asking a question that's basically circular. It says, as long as we feed ourselves, we're okay. Whatever happens to the rest of the species, we don't really care. My belief is that every species has an exactly equal and equivalent right to exist, which makes what I do eating pigs and chickens totally contradictory. I can't make it work. I can't live that philosophy day in, day out, but I can return to it as often as I can, especially when I'm writing about species conservation on the editorial page. As long as we struggle with the issue of how do we protect the species who are in the way of our development, those questions are almost unanswerable. We've got a Congress full of people who simply do not care, and they never have cared. In a way. I can be much more depressing than good. Much help.
Take one more here.
Hopefully this question won't fill you with much despair. This question about teaching writing, you wrote in one of your essays that you're concerned about the quality of the students that you teach now and their inability to write. And I was wondering how your strategy has changed in the last 30 years to try to accommodate the changing students you see.
Well, the answer is it hasn't changed. As far as I can see, I teach some of the best students on the planet, and they can't write. And I mean that they can write a 6 or 8 paragraph academic essay in which they imitate their professor's jargon, and they create sentences that are, I call them on the edge of sustainable confusion, because they're pretty, you feel like they're actually making a sentence, but if you really look at it closely, it's broken apart. The analogy that I always use is the bridge has collapsed and the cars are falling in the water. That's what's happened to this sentence, because it came apart in the middle. I watch this because I see all levels of students from freshmen through graduate students to junior faculty, and it's always the same question. Well, I love to write the way you're talking about writing. I love clearer, shorter sentences, but that's not what the academy requires. I had a PhD student in anthropology take my forestry school class this semester, and she told her 2 advisors that she was going to take it. One of them said, "Don't take it." The other one said, "I really wish I could take it." But I love the guy who said, "Don't take it." He said, "Take notes and put them in a folder and put it away until your dissertation is done, your first book is out, then get it out." Well, what does that say? Because all I'm doing is teaching students to write with incredible clarity. That's it. The assumption is that clarity is of no use in those worlds. And it doesn't matter what the discipline is. English literature, the study of English literature is as bad as any. And it's funny because I always run into people who say, well, things have changed since they don't teach English in the same way you talk about them teaching English in high school or junior high. I'm not sure if that's true. All I know is I see the same results. I see students, and this is the extraordinary part. I see students who come to Yale who do not believe that their own perceptions are important. I see students who come to Yale, Harvard, Malone College, Fordham, everywhere, who nobody has ever said to them, what you notice matters. what they've been taught is you're not authorized to notice yet. You have to be certified to notice. Well, that is the most errant nonsense I can think of. And my job really is, by teaching them to notice language as clearly as they can in making their prose, is to teach them how to notice the world around them, including learning the most important thing of all, which again is something they don't know at all, which is how to have patience in the presence of their own thoughts. That's what writing does. I mean, that's what writing is having patience in the presence of your own thoughts. And the joy of teaching for me is watching these students, literally about the 8th week, their heads look like light bulbs. They've just gotten it. And the extraordinary access of authority they get from that is wonderful. And it comes out of nothing other than simplicity and clarity and directness, which they could easily be teaching in 7th grade. That's where they should learn it. That's where they should perfect it. They should keep it intact all through high school so that it's gem-like in college, but that's just not how it works. Anyway, thank you all for coming out.
Yeah, this has been rich with thoughts
Thank you.
from the countryside to the future of the cosmos. Let's give you time to sign more than a few books outside.